The cicadas were like a broken record, just this endless, grating buzz as I held the last of my boxes out of my beat-up Subaru. August in Havenwood, Maine, felt like stepping into a damp sauna. Sweat instantly glued my shirt to my back, and the black fabric of my new clerical collar felt it was actively drawing heat from the air. This was it, my first parish. At 32. I was older than most guys fresh out of seminary. My calling had been a slow burn, finally catching fire after years of teaching high school English back in Boston. When Bishop Thornton offered me this gig in tiny Havenwood, I jumped at it, maybe with too much enthusiasm and way too little research. St. Jude's Chapel stood in front of me, a weathered gray clapboard building that had definitely seen better days. It had that classic New England church vibe, simple, sturdy, a little austere. A modest steeple pointed towards the overcast sky, topped with a slightly crooked wooden cross. The whole place was surrounded by these huge, ancient pines, their branches heavy with needles, creating this shadowy, almost claustrophobic feel around the church. It was supposed to be charming, I guess, but right now it just felt isolated. The chapel had been without a pastor for almost 2 years. Pastor Hemlock, the last guy, had left under a cloud of, well, no one seemed to want to talk about it. Family emergency, the bishop had said vaguely. Urgent call back to Portland. When I pressed for details, he just added that St. Jude's was a unique parish, with unique pastoral requirements. Right, Miss Crow, the church secretary, a woman with eyes that seemed to see right through you, had met me earlier with the rectory key and a plate of something she called clam-baked casserole. She'd been just as evasive as the bishop. Pastor Hemlock was a good man, she'd said, her voice flat, like she was reading from a script. Just wasn't the right fit for Havenwood. Wasn't the right fit. Something in her tone made the hairs on my arms stand up, even in the muggy heat. I wrestled the last box into the small rectory attached to the chapel. Rectory was a generous term. It was basically a cramped little house tacked onto the side of the church. Modest was an understatement. Bedroom, study, tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Nixon administration. Everything was furnished with a weird mix of antique furniture, but looked like it belonged in a museum, and cheap particle board stuff from the 70s. The walls were covered in this faded, floral wallpaper, peeling at the edges. Water stains bloomed in the corners of the ceiling like something unpleasant. As I dropped the box in the study, I noticed an envelope on the desk. It definitely hadn't been there when Ms. Crow gave me the tour. Father Ethan Blackwood was scrawled on the front in this shaky, spidery handwriting. Inside, a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, with a list of rules typed out on what looked like an ancient typewriter. At the top, in bold, shaky capitals, suxagragulsostgdcpl perciarvid. Rule 1. Always conclude Sunday service before 10:52 a.m. precisely. Rule 2. The front left pew is reserved for the Blackwood family, even if unoccupied. Rule 3. The door to the lightest tower must remain bolted shut at all times. The crank is not to be used except as detailed in the gray logbook. Rule 4. Communion wine must be diluted with 3 drops of seawater collected at Widow's Cove. The vial is never to be replenished by the priest. Rule 5. No baptisms are to be performed during the waning crescent moon. Rule 6. If the altar candles extinguish during service, immediately conclude with the litany of St. Jude and dismiss the congregation. Rule 7. Confessions are only heard during daylight hours, never after dusk, regardless of circumstance. Rule 8. Should you hear children singing sea shanties from the coastline while alone in the chapel, do not investigate. Secure all entrances and recite Psalm 23 until the singing ceases. Rule 9. The center confessional booth is not to be used or opened under any circumstances. Rule 10. If a child presents you with a carving of a seabird, accept it with gratitude but do not bring it into the rectory. Leave it at the base of the old anchor by the harbor wall. Rule 11. Never conduct services if there are exactly 11 people in attendance. Find a reason to postpone or invite someone from town to join. Rule 12. The nautical charts in the parish hall are not to be moved, altered, or discussed with outsiders. Rule 13. Should you find the altar cloth damp with salt water and bearing small shells, replace it immediately and burn the soiled cloth. Do not handle the shells directly. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten note in the same shaky script as the envelope. These obligations have safeguarded St. Jude's for generations. Disregard them at the peril of your flock and your own soul. Welcome to Havenwood, Father Blackwood. May divine providence have mercy. It was signed simply, P.H. Pastor Hemlock. I read the list, a nervous chuckle escaping my lips. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank, right? Hazing the new guy with local folklore and old wives' tales. Even the name of the town. Havenwood, like it was trying too hard to be quaint and welcoming. I set the paper aside and started unpacking my books. Outside, the cicadas suddenly went silent. Unnaturally silent. Through the open window I heard a sound. Distant singing. A woman's voice, low and haunting, singing what sounded like an old sea shanty. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the coastline. My first Sunday, St. Jude's, was shaping up to be interesting. My first Sunday at St. Jude's dawned with a thick fog that swallowed Havenwood whole. Visibility was maybe 10 feet. The rectory windows were beaded with moisture, and the air hung heavy, promising another scorcher of a day, fog or no fog. Despite the gloom, I was surprised to find the little chapel almost full when I walked in from the vestry, robed up and ready to go. Maybe 30 or so parishioners were scattered in the wooden pews, their faces damp, hair plastered to their foreheads from the humidity. They looked expectant. I recognized Miss Crow in the front pew, rowed straight, her gaze intense. Mayor Bellwether, a stout guy whose suit looked about 2 sizes too small, sat beside her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The locals were dressed in their Sunday best, even in the oppressive heat. The men in dark suits, the women in dresses and those elaborate, old-fashioned hats that always seemed out of place in the modern world. As I walked towards the pulpit, I noticed the front, left pew was empty, just like Rule 2 said it would be. A worn, leather-bound hymnal sat on the seat, along with a single white rose in a small vase. The Blackwood pew. I'd asked Men's Crow about them yesterday. Old Havenwood family, she'd said, arranging lilies on the altar. Been here since before the town was even called Havenwood. Don't come around much these days, but we keep their place. Moved away, I'd asked, trying to sound casual. Ms. Crow had given me this odd, sidelong look. Not exactly, Father. They're still around. And then she'd just gone back to fussing with the lilies, like the conversation was over. Now, facing my congregation for the first time, I plastered on my best new, pastor-enthusiastic smile. Good morning, and peace be with you, I said, my voice echoing a little in the old chapel. I'm Father Ethan Blackwood, and I'm honored to be joining the St. Jude's family. And also with you. They responded in unison, their voices blending in the strange acoustics of the chapel. It was a little too unison. A little too practiced. I couldn't help but notice a few parishioners glancing at their watches, or at the antique clock hanging at the back of the nave. Rule 1 echoed in my mind. Always conclude Sunday service before 10:52 a.m. precisely. An oddly specific time. I'd initially written it off as just another weird local quirk, but seeing their collective fixation on the time gave me pause. The service moved forward smoothly enough. Hymns, readings, the usual Sunday liturgy. When it came time for communion, I slipped back into the vestry. The vial mentioned in Rule 4 sat on a small shelf, tucked away behind some dusty hymnals. It was old, hand-blown glass, filled with maybe an inch of clear liquid. Seawater from Widow's Cove. Right. I uncorked the wine and, feeling a little ridiculous, carefully added 3 drops from the vial. The liquid that dripped from the vial's spout was clear, but it seemed to catch the light in a weird way, almost shimmering. Definitely not normal water. Communion itself was uneventful, though I noticed a few parishioners watching me closely as they sipped from the chalice. Did they know about the seawater? Was this all some elaborate test for the new priest? As I launched into my sermon, something generic about community and new beginnings, a sudden clap of thunder rattled the chapel windows. The lights flickered, and in that split second of darkness, I saw something odd in the front left pew. A shimmer in the air above the empty seat, like heat rising off asphalt on a hot day. When the light stabilized, it was gone. I blinked, wondering if I'd imagined. I checked my watch. 10:37 a.m. Plenty of time to wrap things up before the mysterious 10:52 deadline. As we moved forward together, I continued, trying to ignore the weird shimmer thing. I hope to learn from each of you about the rich traditions of St. Jude's. Another thunderclap, closer this time. The chapel plunged into darkness for a good 5 seconds. When the emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in this sickly yellow glow, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The white rose in the vase on the Blackwood pew. It had completely wilted. Brown and shriveled, like it had been dead for weeks. Beside it, the hymnal lay open, though I was almost certain it had been closed before. I forced myself to keep going, acutely aware of the congregation's eyes on me, sensing their unease. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the windows, and the tall altar candles, thick, Beeswax pillars sputtered and swayed violently. Rule 6 flashed through my mind. If the altar candles extinguish during service, immediately conclude. I watched the candle flames with growing dread as they bent almost horizontal, flickering wildly in a draft that shouldn't exist in a closed building. The electric lights flickered again, and this time, in the brief darkness, I could have sworn I saw figures in the front left pew. Shadowy outlines of people where there had been nothing before. Then the lights came back on, and they were gone. The candles, miraculously, steadied. Much to my relief. I glanced at my watch again, 10:43 a.m. I'd have said, cutting my sermon short and moving into the closing liturgy. The congregation bowed their heads, but I saw several still watching the candles from the corners of their eyes. As I led the closing prayer, I became aware of a strange smell in the chapel, something like damp earth mixed with something else, something sweet but rotten, decay. It seemed strongest near the altar. I glanced down, mid-sentence, and froze. The pristine white altar cloth now bore a distinct stain. Mud. A muddy handprint, small like a child's, with fingers that seemed too long, too slender. And within the mud, tiny white shells gleamed, catching the dim light like pearls. Rule 13. Should you find the altar cloth damp with salt water and bearing small shells, replace it immediately and burn the soiled cloth. My hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but the congregation noticed. Miss Crow's eyes widened, alarm flashing in their depths. Mayor Bellwether half rose from his pew. "Father," he said urgently, gesturing at my wrist. "Father," the time. It was 10:49 a.m. I swallowed hard and switched gears, launching into the litany of St. Jude. I'd thankfully reviewed it the night before, just out of curiosity. See Jude, glorious apostle, faithful servant and friend of Jesus. As I recited the litany, the handprint on the altar cloth seemed to darken. The mud became almost black. The tiny white shells, they started to move. Just slightly, like grains of rice in boiling water. Intercede for us in our need. In every affliction. Look down with pity from heaven and help us in our distress. I finished the litany and dismissed the congregation, my hands shaking. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. They responded, already scrambling to gather their things with unusual haste. The clock at the back of the nave ticked past 10:51 a.m. Miss Crow was at the altar as the last parishioners filed out. Her face was grim. Without a word, she produced a clean altar cloth from a drawer in the communion table and gestured for me to step aside. "I'll take care of this, Father," she said quietly, carefully folding the soiled cloth without touching the handprint. "You should go to the rectory now. Quickly." "But what's happening? What are these shells?" She glanced at the clock, 10:52 a.m. "Not shells, Father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Teeth. 3 days after my first, deeply unsettling service. I was perched on the rectory porch, nursing a glass of iced tea that was doing absolutely nothing to combat the swampy heat. Fireflies blinked to life in the cemetery across the yard, rising from the tangled grass around the headstones like lost souls flickering in the twilight. The evening air was thick and heavy, promising yet another thunderstorm before morning. Somewhere in the distance, an accordion wheezed out a mournful tune. Havenwood. It was starting to feel less like a haven and more like a well, like a trap. I'd spent the last few days buried in research, trying to make sense of the weirdness. Parish records, town histories, anything I could get my hands on. St. Jude's history stretched back to the early 1800s. Apparently, the chapel had been built by seafaring families who'd split off from some bigger settlement further down the coast after the incident at Widow's Cove. The records vaguely called it. The founding families, Blackwood, Crow, Bellwether, Hemlock, names that still filled my pews, had established Havenwood as a place of refuge. Refuge from what, exactly? The records were frustratingly silent on that point. The Blackwood family name kept popping up, again and again, throughout St. Jude's history, always linked to unusual events. A faded notation from 1888 mentioned a Blackwood intervention during some kind of coastal storm that supposedly threatened to wash away the entire town. Another, from 1932, described a young Elias Blackwood's vigil for the parish's protection. The most recent entry, just 3 years ago, was chillingly simple. Elias Blackwood returned. Arrangements made as per tradition. Despite their obvious importance, I hadn't met a single Blackwood in the flesh. The screen door creaked behind me, and I turned to see Miss Crow standing there, holding a covered dish. The smell of something rich and savory wafted out. "Lobster bisque, maybe?" "Thought you might be hungry, Father," she said, setting the dish on the rickety table between the porch rockers. Men forget to eat when they're lost in books. You're too kind, Miss Crow, I said, gesturing for her to sit. Actually, I was just reading about the Blackwood family. Miss Crow settled into the rocker, her hands, gnarled and weathered like driftwood, folded in her lap. That's their way, she said, her gaze drifting towards the cemetery, where the fog was starting to swirl around the older headstones. They come when they're needed. Needed for what? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She just nodded towards the front, left pew, the reserved pew. The rows. Tradition, she said firmly. Some traditions, they keep things balanced. I decided to be direct. Miss Crow, what really happened to Pastor Hemlock? She was silent for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she sighed a long, drawn-out sound like the wind in the pines. He broke Rule 7, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Here to confession after dusk. Whose confession? I leaned forward, suddenly intensely interested. Wasn't one of our parishioners. She glanced around. Even though we were alone on the porch. Despite the fog, it was after dark. Boot, whose confession did he hear? I pressed. Eliza Blackwood. She said the name like it was a curse. Boot, it wasn't entirely Eliza anymore. Miss Crow quickly made the sign of the cross, her lips moving silently. The bishop transferred him to some monastery up in the mountains after we found him. He hasn't spoken a word since that night. Before I could ask any more questions, the accordion music stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was jarring. In the quiet, the distant rumble of thunder seemed unnaturally loud. You should go inside now, Father, Miss Crow said, rising quickly. Storm's coming. Don't open your door tonight, no matter who calls. The rules, they don't cover everything. She hurried down the porch steps and across the churchyard, her figure swallowed by the gathering gloom. I stayed on the porch, wrestling with my growing unease. Part of me, the rational, seminary-educated part, wanted to dismiss all of this as small-town superstition, overactive imaginations, grief twisted into folklore. But another part, something deeper, more primal, recognized the genuine fear in Miss Crow's eyes. The raw bone, deep terror. As if punctuating my thoughts, a flash of lightning ripped across the sky, illuminating the cemetery for a split second. In that flash, I thought I saw a figure standing among the tombs. A woman in white. Her face was turned towards the rectory. Then darkness slammed down again, and she was gone. I grabbed my iced tea and the untouched lobster bisque. My appetite had vanished, and retreated inside, locking the door behind me. The storm hit Havenwood with full force. Rain lashed against the windows, rattling the old glass. The wind howled in the eaves. Preparing for bed, I felt cold despite the humid air. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by unsettling dreams of whispered confessions in a language I didn't understand. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke to a gentle knocking at the rectory door. Remembering Ms. Crow's warning, I froze in bed, breathing. Father Blackwood. A woman's voice, low and melodic, with a coastal Maine accent thick as pea soup. I need to make my confession. Please, open the door. I stayed silent. I know you're awake, Father. The voice was closer now, right outside the door. I can help you understand this place. The rules, the real history of St. Jude's. Despite every rational instinct screaming at me to stay put, I found myself drawn to the door. My hand was actually on the knob when lightning flashed again, illuminating the crack beneath the door, and the water seeping under it, not rainwater. Something darker, thicker, that smelled salty, like the ocean. Just open the door. Father Blackwood, the voice purred. Don't you want to meet the Blackwood family? We've been waiting so long for a priest who truly understands. The doorknob turned beneath my hand, not by my action on its own. The lock clicked open. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stumbled back from the door. Our pew sits empty, the voice continued, now coming from directly outside my bedroom window. But we never really left Havenwood. Havenwood belongs to us. St. Jude's belongs to us. Thunder cracked directly overhead. The power went out. The rectory plunged into absolute darkness. In that blackness, I heard it, the distinct sound of my front door opening, followed by footsteps in the hall. Multiple sets. Moving with this odd, dragging rhythm. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak flashlight to frantically scan for the list of rules. Nothing about nocturnal visitors. Nothing about what to do when a locked door opens by itself. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. The floorboards creaked as someone or something leaned against it. Father Blackwood. A different voice now, older. Male. With a rasp like dry seaweed being dragged across rocks. We missed church on Sunday. We'd like our own private service. The doorknob began to turn again. Desperate. I grabbed my prayer book and rosary, backing towards the window. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I began, my voice trembling. A soft chuckle came from the other side of the door. We are God-fearing folk, Father. But our God and yours, well, they have different appetites. The door creaked open a fraction. Through the crack, I caught a glimpse of pale faces in the darkness. Too pale, with eyes that reflected the weak light from my phone like something not quite human. The smell that wafted in was the same sweet decay I'd noticed during Sunday service, only amplified, overwhelming. Suddenly, the chapel bells began to toll. Impossible, given the hour. And the bolted lighthouse door. 1, 2, 3 steady, deliberate peals that shook the rectory's thin walls. The figures in the hallway paused, their collective breath drawing in sharply. The old ways still hold, hissed the woman's voice, now edged with anger. But not forever, new priest. Not forever. The door slammed shut with such force the frame cracked. The footsteps retreated rapidly, accompanied by an odd clicking sound, like fingernails on hardwood. I heard my front door crash open, then silence, broken only by the continuing bells. 7, 8, 9, I remained frozen in place, clutching my rosary so tightly the beads bit into my palm. 12, 13. The 13th bell resonated longer than the others, its tone shifting, deepening, into something almost guttural, before fading away. When dawn finally bled through the fog, I found my front door standing wide open. Muddy footprints tracked from the porch, across the rectory floor, leading towards the chapel. The prints were strange, too long, with oddly jointed toes that left sharp indentations in the wood, like they'd had claws. On the rectory steps lay a fresh white rose and a note written elegant, old-fashioned script. Sunday next, Father Blackwood. Our pew won't be empty. Prepare the seawater properly. It was signed simply, the Blackwoods. The morning after the nocturnal visit, I called Bishop Thornton in Portland. The conversation was brief and utterly unhelpful. Every parish has its idiosyncrasies, Father Blackwood, he'd said, his voice crackling over the terrible cell connection. Steep. Jude's more than most, With all due respect, Bishop Thornton. I'd started, trying to keep my voice level. What happened last night went beyond idiosyncrasies. I had intruders. The lighthouse bell tower, which I'm told must remain bolted shut at all times, somehow rang 13 times at 3 in the morning. A long pause followed. The bell tower rang 13 times, you say, and you found muddy footprints. Another pause, longer this time. I'm sending Father Antoine Leblanc to assist you. He grew up near Havenwood, understands the local traditions. Until he arrives, follow the sacred obligations to the letter. To the letter, Father Blackwood. And find the gray logbook. It should be in the vestry somewhere. He hung up before I could press for any actual information. The gray logbook. Rule 3 had mentioned it in connection with the lighthouse tower crank. The crank is not to be used except as detailed in the gray logbook. I spent the morning tearing apart the vestry, searching every drawer, every dusty corner. The small room was crammed with decades of accumulated church junk, tarnished candlesticks, moth-eaten vestments, boxes of half-melted communion wafers. No logbook. Ms. Crow arrived around noon, carrying a steaming pot of clam chowder and a loaf of crusty bread. Her eyes widened when she saw the vestry in complete disarray. Spring cleaning already, Father. I'm looking for something called the gray logbook. I explained. The bishop mentioned it. She carefully set the food down, her expression guarded. That's been missing for some time. Pastor Hemlock had it last. And where might he have kept it? I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. Miss Crow hesitated, glancing towards the window, towards the lighthouse tower in the distance. Have you been up to the lighthouse tower yet, Father? The rules say it's to remain bolted, yes. But you're the priest. Sometimes you need to check that everything's secure up there. She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced an ancient-looking iron crank. Just remember to bolt it shut when you're done. And Father, don't linger after dusk. With that cryptic warning, she left me to my chowder and my mounting anxiety. I waited until the afternoon light was strong before venturing out to the lighthouse. The narrow, winding path leading up to it was overgrown and choked with weeds. The air grew noticeably colder as I approached the stone tower, carrying the heavy iron crank. It smelled damp and faintly fishy. The heavy wooden door at the base of the tower was indeed bolted shut. The crank fit the rusty mechanism perfectly, turning with a protesting groan of old metal. The lighthouse chamber was small, circular, the thick stone walls cold to the touch. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that slanted through the narrow, arched windows. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay. The lighthouse lamp itself was massive, a Fresnel lens, dark and silent at the center of the chamber. Below it, a small wooden desk stood against the curved wall. And there it was. A book bound in faded gray leather, the gray logbook. Beside it lay another dead seabird, this one a gull, its feathers ruffled and dull, its eyes empty sockets. I approached cautiously, half expecting the lighthouse lamp to suddenly blaze to life, or the bell to start clanging on its own. When nothing happened, I picked up the logbook, brushing dust from its cover. The leather felt strangely cold, almost clammy, in my hand. The book's title, stamped in faded silver leaf, read Custodia Maris, Guardian of the Sea. I opened it carefully. The spine creaked like old bones. The first pages were filled with entries in elegant, looping script, dating back to the chapel's founding. Weather reports, ship sightings, mundane parish business. But as I flipped through the pages, the entries became stranger. References to the deepening, the hunger, the rituals maintained. There were sketches, too, crude drawings of things that were vaguely human-shaped, but twisted, wrong, with too many limbs, too many eyes, things that definitely did not belong in any natural world. Then I found it, an entry, written in a shaky hand I recognized from the Sacred Rules. Note Pastor Hemlock's. It was dated just weeks before he left Havenwood. The lease is changed. The bargain is failing. The pull from the deep is too strong. The rituals, are they enough anymore? I fear for Havenwood. I fear for my soul. The page after that was blank, except for a single word scrawled in charcoal. Run. A chill deeper than the cold stone of the lighthouse settled over me. I slammed the logbook shut, my heart hammering in my chest. From below, I heard the chapel door creak open, footsteps in the nave, Father Blackwood. Miss Crow's voice, calling from the base of the lighthouse stairs. Are you up there? Father, you need to come down, now. Her voice was tight with urgency. I hesitated for only a moment, then grabbed the gray logbook, tucking it under my arm. Something was definitely wrong. Terribly wrong. I bolted the lighthouse door, jamming the crank back into place, and started down the winding stairs, taking them two at a time. Miss Crow was waiting for me at the bottom, her face pale and drawn. Father, it's Eliza Blackwood, she's here, in the chapel. Doc, Eliza Blackwood, I repeated, confused. Boot, I thought you said the Blackwoods only come when they're rear. There's no time for explaining, Father. Just you need to get back to the rectory. Lock yourself in. Don't engage with her. But she's in the chapel. Shouldn't I? Miss Crow grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. No, Father. The chapel, it's not safe right now. You are not safe. Please, just trust me. Go, now. She practically shoved me back towards the rectory. I glanced back at the chapel. The heavy wooden doors were closed. But through the stained, glass windows, I could see a flickering light. Candles. Someone was lighting candles in the chapel. After dusk. I ran back to the rectory, adrenaline pumping. I slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock, throwing every bolt I could find. Peeking through the curtains, I saw Ms. Crow standing in the churchyard, facing the chapel, her posture rigid, defiant, like she was standing guard. Inside the rectory, the air felt suddenly colder. The silence was heavy, oppressive. I grabbed the list of sacred rules, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. Rule after rule swam before my eyes, meaningless now, useless. Except Rule 8. Should you hear children singing sea shanties from the coastline while alone in the chapel, do not investigate. Secure all entrances and recite Psalm 23 until the singing ceases. Children singing sea shanties. Coastline. Lighthouse. It clicked. The singing I'd heard the first night. The woman's voice. It wasn't a sea shanty, not exactly. But it was coastal. And definitely not human. And I wasn't alone in the rectory. I could feel it, a presence. Something listening, watching. From the direction of the chapel, carried on the rising wind, I heard it. Singing. Faint at first, then growing louder. Children's voices. High, reedy off key. Singing something that sounded vaguely like a sea shanty, but twisted, corrupted, the melody wrong. The words gibberish. But somehow chillingly understandable. In a way that bypassed my ears and went straight to the bone. From the depths we rise, where shadows sleep. Havenwood's ours, the secret's deep. The singing grew louder, closer. The rectory windows rattled, the temperature plummeted. I scrambled for my prayer book, my rosary, anything. 23. Right. I flipped to the psalm, my fingers clumsy, fumbling with the thin pages. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I started to recite, my voice trembling, barely a whisper. The singing intensified, swirling around the rectory, pressing in. The children's voices were joined by another voice now. Lower, melodic, the woman's voice from the other night. Singing along with the children, harmonizing in a way that was deeply, profoundly wrong. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he litteth me beside the still waters. My voice cracked. I could barely breathe. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, overwhelming now, making me gag. The singing was right outside the rectory walls now, pressing against the clapboard siding. I could hear movement outside, dragging sounds, clicking sounds. The muddy footprints I remembered. The claws. Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Tears streamed down my face. I was terrified. Utterly, completely terrified. But I kept reciting the psalm, clinging to the words like a lifeline. The singing reached a crescendo, a deafening chorus of children's voices, and the woman's haunting melody. Then abruptly, it stopped. Silence descended on Havenwood, broken only by the howling wind. The oppressive cold began to recede. The smell of decay faded. I kept reciting Psalm 23 over and over until my voice was hoarse. Until the first faint light of dawn crept through the fog-shrouded windows. Until I was sure they were gone. When Father LeBlanc arrived later that morning, I was a wreck. Exhausted, terrified, barely coherent. He took one look at me, at the gray logbook clutched in my hand, at the muddy footprints, still faintly visible on the rectory floor, and he just nodded, a grim understanding in his eyes. "Welcome to Havenwood, Father Blackwood," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Looks like you've met the Blackwoods." He didn't smile. Neither did I, my first parish, and it was already feeling like my last.